My name is Alexandra Thompson, and I'm 34 years old. 3 months ago, I walked into Pentagon Briefing Room 3A, wearing the silver star of a Brigadier General, making history as the youngest female general in Air Force history. But that's not the moment that changed everything. The moment that changed everything happened 15 years earlier, when my own mother looked me straight in the eye and said words that still echo in my mind today. "Alex, you're too soft, too emotional, too scattered to ever be officer material. You'll never make it past basic training, let alone lead anyone." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the sting of those words as clearly as if she'd spoken them yesterday. We were standing in our kitchen in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the morning after I'd announced my acceptance to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Instead of congratulations, instead of pride, I received doubt wrapped in what she called motherly concern. The woman who was supposed to believe in me more than anyone else in the world had just told me I wasn't strong enough to chase my dreams. What she didn't know that morning was that her words would become the fuel that propelled me through every challenge, every setback, every moment when I wanted to quit. What she didn't know was that 3,000 miles away, in a Pentagon office she'd never see, military leaders were already tracking my progress, already seeing something in me that my own family couldn't recognize. What she didn't know was that her daughter, the one she thought too weak to lead, would one day brief the Secretary of Defense on matters of national security. The Thompson family home on Maple Street looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. White picket fence, wraparound porch, and the kind of manicured lawn that spoke of suburban success. My father, Robert Thompson, had built Thompson and Associates from nothing, turning a small accounting practice into one of Cedar Falls's most respected firms. My mother, Patricia, managed the social calendar and community image with the precision of a military operation, though she'd never admit the irony of that comparison. From the outside, we were the perfect American family, but inside those pristine walls, perfection came with conditions, and those conditions had been carefully crafted around one central theme: maintaining the family legacy. My older brother Daniel was groomed from birth to take over the business. Every dinner conversation revolved around quarterly reports, tax seasons, and client relations. Daniel absorbed it all with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved numbers and the steady predictability of small-town business success. My younger sister Natalie found her place as the family's social butterfly. She excelled at everything Patricia valued: charity committees, country club events, and the kind of graceful small talk that opened doors in Cedar Falls society. Natalie wore designer dresses to high school dances and dated the sons of my father's business partners. She was everything a Thompson daughter was supposed to be, and then there was me, Alex Thompson, the middle child who never quite fit the mold they'd created. While Daniel studied business reports and Natalie practiced piano for the annual charity recital, I spent my afternoons reading military biographies and watching documentaries about World War II. I was fascinated by stories of strategy, leadership under pressure, and the kind of courage that emerged when everything was on the line. My parents tolerated what they called my phase with the patient indulgence reserved for childhood hobbies they assumed I'd outgrow. When I asked for military history books for Christmas, they bought them alongside suggestions for business magazines. When I mentioned wanting to attend a military academy, they nodded politely and changed the subject to college prep courses that would better prepare me for a business degree. The first crack in our family's perfect facade appeared during my junior year of high school. I'd been secretly working with my guidance counselor to prepare my application for West Point, gathering recommendation letters, maintaining the grades and physical fitness standards required for consideration. The process was rigorous, demanding, and exactly the kind of challenge that made me feel alive in ways that balance sheets and profit margins never could. I kept my plans quiet because I knew the reaction I'd face. The Thompson family legacy was built on stability, on choosing the safe path, on maintaining what previous generations had worked to create. Military service represented everything they feared: uncertainty, danger, and a complete departure from the life they'd mapped out for their children. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. My English teacher, Miss Henderson, mentioned my military academy essay during a parent-teacher conference, praising my passion and dedication to something she clearly thought my parents already knew about. The car ride home that night was silent in the way that promises difficult conversations ahead. The confrontation came 3 days later, after my acceptance letter arrived. I'd been checking the mail obsessively for weeks, my heart racing every time I saw the familiar logo of the United States Military Academy. When the thick envelope finally appeared, I knew before opening it that my life was about to change forever. The letter was everything I'd hoped for. Congratulations, welcome to the class of 2009, reporting instructions for basic training. I walked into our house with hands trembling from excitement and nervousness, knowing that this moment would define not just my future, but my relationship with my family. I found my parents in the living room, my mother arranging flowers while my father reviewed client files. Daniel was there too, visiting from his sophomore year at Iowa State, where he was studying business administration as expected. The words came out in a rush. I'd been accepted to West Point. I was going to serve my country. I was going to become an officer in the United States Air Force. I was going to make them proud in ways they never expected. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching between us like a chasm I suddenly wasn't sure I could cross. My father spoke first, his voice carefully controlled in the way that meant he was processing information he didn't want to hear. He asked about the commitment, the years of service required after graduation, the risk to life and limb that military service entailed. His questions were practical, financial, centered around the investment of time and money that my choice represented. But it was my mother's reaction that cut deepest. Patricia Thompson, the woman who'd raised me to believe I could accomplish anything, looked at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before, genuine doubt about my capabilities. She didn't question my intelligence or my dedication. She questioned whether I had the fundamental strength of character required to lead others in life or death situations. Her words were measured, delivered with the kind of careful precision she used when delivering bad news to extended family. She spoke about my sensitivity, my tendency to take things personally, my occasional moments of self-doubt that she'd witnessed throughout my childhood. She painted a picture of someone too emotionally invested, too prone to second-guessing, too fundamentally soft to thrive in an environment that demanded absolute confidence and unwavering determination. Daniel supported her assessment with the brotherly honesty that stung precisely because it came from someone who knew me well. He reminded me of times I'd cried over failed tests, moments when I'd struggled with conflict, instances when I'd chosen compromise over confrontation. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He genuinely believed he was protecting me from a future that would break me. Natalie remained diplomatically silent, but I could see in her expression the relief of someone grateful that the family spotlight had shifted away from her own choice. She'd always been the easy child, the one who met expectations without challenge or controversy. My announcement had disrupted the careful balance our family maintained, and her silence spoke volumes about which side she'd chosen. The conversation lasted 3 hours, moving from the living room to the kitchen to the back porch as daylight faded into evening. They presented alternative options with the enthusiasm of people trying to redirect a runaway train. Business school at Iowa State, where I could join Daniel and eventually take over the firm. Liberal arts education at a prestigious private college, followed by a safe career in education or nonprofit work. Graduate school in public administration, leading to a comfortable government job that offered service without the physical and emotional demands of military life. Each suggestion felt like another nail in the coffin of dreams I'd been nurturing for years. They weren't trying to crush my spirit. They genuinely believed they were saving me from crushing disappointment. In their minds, I was the daughter who needed protection, guidance, and a gentle nudge toward more realistic aspiration. The breaking point came when my mother, exhausted by hours of circular discussion, finally spoke the words that would haunt both of us for years to come. She looked directly at me, her expression softened by what she probably thought was maternal wisdom, and delivered her verdict with the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. She told me I was too soft, too emotional, too scattered to ever be officer material. She predicted I'd never make it past basic training, let alone develop into someone capable of leading others. She painted a picture of inevitable failure, of dreams crushed by the harsh reality of military demands, of a daughter who'd return home broken and defeated, forced to rebuild a life she'd abandoned for impossible aspiration. Her words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at insecurities she knew I carried. She wasn't being intentionally cruel, she was trying to prevent what she saw as inevitable heartbreak. But the effect was devastating, creating doubt where there had been certainty, fear where there had been excitement. I went to bed that night questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. Maybe they were right, maybe I was fooling myself about my capability. Maybe the military was a fantasy, a childhood dream that would crumble under the weight of adult reality. Maybe the safe path, the expected path, was the only path that made sense for someone like me. But in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by reminders of the girl I'd been, something else began to crystallize. A quiet determination that had nothing to do with proving them wrong and everything to do with proving something to myself. I'd been accepted to one of the most prestigious military academies in the world. Someone, somewhere, had seen potential in me that my own family couldn't recognize. That night, I made a decision that would define the next 15 years of my life. I wasn't going to West Point to prove my mother wrong. I was going to West Point to discover who I really was when everything I thought I knew about myself was stripped away. I was going to find out what Alexandra Thompson was truly made of when comfort, familiarity, and family expectations were no longer available as safety nets. The next morning, I confirmed my acceptance to West Point. My parents accepted my decision with the resigned disappointment of people who'd done everything they could to prevent what they saw as a mistake. We spent the remaining months, before I left for New York, in a state of careful politeness, avoiding the topic that had created such a fundamental rift between us. But every night, as I prepared for the challenge ahead, I heard my mother's words echoing in my mind. Too soft, too emotional, too scattered, never make it past basic training, never be officer material. Those words became a soundtrack to my preparation, a constant reminder of what I had to overcome, not just in myself, but in the perceptions of everyone who'd ever doubted my potential.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
What I didn't know then was that doubt, properly channeled, could become the most powerful motivator in the world. What I didn't know was that the girl my mother thought too weak to lead would spend the next decade and a half proving that strength comes in forms that small-town expectations never recognize. What I didn't know was that 3,000 miles from Cedar Falls, in offices where national security decisions were made, people were already watching, already noting the potential that my own family couldn't see. The morning I left for West Point, my mother hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes and whispered that she hoped I'd prove her wrong. But I was no longer interested in proving anything to her. I was interested in discovering everything I was capable of becoming, when the only voice that mattered was the one inside my own head, telling me to keep moving forward no matter what anyone else believed about my potential. That was the beginning of a journey that would take me from the doubt-filled kitchen of a house on Maple Street to the highest levels of military leadership. But the real journey, the one that transformed not just my career but my understanding of what it means to be strong, started with learning to trust my own voice over the voices of people who loved me but couldn't see me clearly. The girl who was too soft to be officer material was about to discover what she was really made of. And 15 years later, standing in Pentagon Briefing Room 3A, wearing the silver star of a Brigadier General, I would finally understand that my mother's doubt hadn't weakened me. It had forged me into exactly the leader my country needed, in ways none of us could have imagined. That morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa, West Point in July felt like stepping into another universe. The Hudson River Valley stretched endlessly before me, as our bus wound through the academy gates, past stone buildings that had witnessed over 2 centuries of American military history. I pressed my face to the window, trying to absorb every detail of the place that would either break me or transform me into something I'd never imagined possible. The other incoming cadets on the bus carried themselves with a confidence I envied. They came from military families, prep schools, and backgrounds that had prepared them for this moment their entire life. I overheard conversations about family traditions, fathers and grandfathers who'd walked these same paths, legacy admissions that carried the weight of generational expectation. I sat quietly, clutching the single duffel bag that contained everything I'd brought from my old life, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my existence. Reception day began at dawn with upperclassmen screaming instructions I could barely comprehend. The transformation from civilian to cadet happened so quickly I barely had time to process the loss of everything familiar. My hair, which I'd grown long throughout high school, disappeared in minutes under electric clippers operated by a barber who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. The clothes I'd carefully chosen for my journey to New York were replaced by identical uniforms that erased every trace of individual identity. But it was the psychological pressure that nearly broke me in those first hours. Upperclassmen, who looked barely older than me, shouted contradictory orders while I fumbled with equipment I'd never seen before. I dropped my rifle twice during the first weapons inspection, earning screaming reprimands that echoed across the courtyard. My hands shook as I tried to fold clothes according to specifications that seemed designed to be impossible to achieve. During those first weeks of cadet basic training, my mother's words haunted every failure. When I struggled to complete the obstacle course in the required time, I heard her voice telling me I was too soft for this life. When I received my first failing grade on a military knowledge exam, I wondered if she'd been right about my inability to handle pressure. When I cried quietly in my bunk after a particularly brutal day of training, I felt like I was proving every doubt she'd ever expressed about my suitability for military service. My roommate, Lisa Chang, came from a family of Marine Corps officers who'd instilled discipline and military bearing from birth. She navigated the demands of cadet life with an ease that made my struggles feel even more pronounced. Lisa never complained about the physical challenges, never questioned the logic behind seemingly arbitrary rules, never showed the emotional vulnerability that I fought to conceal every single day. But Lisa also possessed something I hadn't expected to find at West Point: genuine kindness masked behind the stoic exterior that military training demanded. During our third week, after I'd failed my second consecutive room inspection for improperly arranged personal items, she quietly showed me the techniques her father had taught her for achieving the precision that military life required. She never made me feel stupid or inadequate. She simply shared knowledge that helped me meet standards I'd been struggling to achieve. The academic challenges proved equally demanding. While I'd excelled in high school, West Point academics operated on a completely different level. Mathematics, science, and engineering courses designed to produce leaders capable of managing complex technological systems pushed my intellectual capabilities beyond anything I'd previously experienced. I spent nights studying until my eyes burned, reviewing concepts that seemed to come naturally to classmates who'd attended elite preparatory schools. My first major crisis came during our fifth week, when I received notification that I was failing calculus and in danger of academic dismissal. The professor, a retired Army colonel who'd built his reputation on demanding excellence, called me to his office for what I assumed would be my exit interview from military academy life. I walked across campus that afternoon convinced that my West Point experience was about to end in exactly the kind of failure my mother had predicted. Colonel Rodriguez surprised me. Instead of delivering dismissal papers, he asked questions about my background, my motivations for attending West Point, and my long-term goals in military service. He listened without judgment as I explained my struggles with mathematical concepts that had never been properly introduced during my small-town high school education. He noted my perfect attendance, my obvious effort, and my willingness to seek help despite the competitive environment that often discouraged admissions of weakness. What followed was the first of many mentoring relationships that would define my military career. Colonel Rodriguez arranged for additional tutoring, adjusted my study schedule to maximize learning efficiency, and most importantly, helped me understand that struggling with new concepts didn't indicate fundamental inadequacy. He shared stories of other cadets who'd overcome similar challenges, including several who'd gone on to distinguished military careers despite rocky beginnings at the academy. But the real transformation began during our first leadership challenge. Cadets were assigned to lead small groups through complex problem-solving exercises designed to test decision-making under pressure. I was terrified, convinced that my emotional nature would prove disastrous when others depended on my leadership. The scenario involved planning a tactical response to a simulated emergency, requiring quick analysis of incomplete information, and confident direction of teammates who might question my authority. Something unexpected happened when the exercise began. The analytical skills that had made me struggle with pure mathematics suddenly proved invaluable for processing complex, ambiguous situations. While other cadets rushed toward quick decisions, I found myself naturally gathering input from team members, synthesizing different perspectives, and developing comprehensive solutions that addressed variables others had overlooked. My supposed emotional sensitivity, which my mother had identified as a fatal weakness, translated into awareness of team dynamics that enhanced our collective performance. I noticed when teammates felt excluded from decision-making processes, when personality conflicts threatened mission success, and when individual strengths were being underutilized. Rather than seeing these observations as distractions, I learned to incorporate human factors into leadership calculations. Our team won the exercise, but more importantly, I discovered something about leadership that contradicted everything I'd been told about my limitations. Effective leadership wasn't about suppressing emotion or maintaining artificial distance from the people under your command. It was about understanding human nature well enough to inspire peak performance from individuals with different motivations, different strengths, and different fears. The recognition came gradually. Other cadets began seeking my input on group projects, not because I was the smartest or most technically proficient, but because I had a talent for helping teams function more effectively. Instructors noticed my ability to identify potential problems before they developed into crises, to mediate conflicts that might otherwise derail important missions, and to maintain morale during challenging circumstances. My first semester grades reflected this growth. While I'd struggled initially with pure technical subjects, my performance in leadership courses, military history, and strategic studies placed me among the top performers in our class. The comprehensive approach to problem solving that had seemed like a disadvantage in narrow academic contexts proved highly valuable when applied to the complex, multifaceted challenges that military leaders face in real-world situations. But the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. During our winter break, I received a letter from the Air Force Academy's liaison officer, who'd been monitoring the performance of cadets expressing interest in Air Force careers after graduation. The letter informed me that my leadership ratings and academic progress had earned me consideration for advanced placement in pilot training programs, traditionally reserved for the highest performing cadets. I read that letter 3 times before the implications fully registered. The girl my mother thought too scattered to complete basic training was being considered for one of the most demanding and prestigious career tracks in military aviation. The emotional sensitivity that had been framed as a liability was being recognized as an asset by professionals whose job was identifying future military leaders. That letter changed something fundamental in how I saw myself. I began to understand that my family's definition of strength was narrow, shaped by the specific demands of small-town business success, rather than the broader spectrum of capabilities that military service required. The qualities that made someone effective at managing accounting clients weren't necessarily the same qualities that made someone effective at leading troops under combat conditions. My second year at West Point brought new challenges, but also new confidence in my ability to meet them. I was selected for additional leadership responsibilities, including positions that required managing the performance and development of younger cadets. These experiences taught me that leadership was less about commanding from a position of authority, and more about inspiring others to achieve capabilities they didn't know they possessed. I found myself naturally gravitating toward cadets who struggled with the same self-doubt I'd experienced during my first months at the academy. I recognized the signs: the perfectionism that led to paralysis, the fear of failure that prevented risk-taking, the imposter syndrome that convinced talented individuals they didn't belong in elite environments. My own journey through these challenges had taught me how to help others navigate similar obstacles. During my third year, I was selected as a company commander, responsible for the daily leadership of over 100 cadets. The position required balancing administrative responsibilities with mentoring duties, managing discipline issues while maintaining unit morale, and representing cadet interests to academy leadership while enforcing institutional standards. It was exactly the kind of complex, multifaceted leadership challenge that played to my strengths. Under my leadership, our company achieved recognition for academic performance, military bearing, and unit cohesion. But more personally satisfying were the individual success stories. Cadets who'd been struggling academically suddenly finding their footing, personality conflicts being resolved through mediation rather than disciplinary action, and a general sense that our unit had become a place where people felt supported in their efforts to excel. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. The girl who'd left Cedar Falls wondering if she had what it took to survive military training had become a young woman who others looked to for guidance and inspiration. The emotional sensitivity that my family had seen as weakness had evolved into emotional intelligence that enhanced every aspect of my leadership effectiveness. During my senior year, I received notification that I'd been selected for pilot training, with assignment to strategic intelligence operations. It was a career path that combined flying with analytical work, requiring both technical proficiency and the kind of comprehensive understanding of complex systems that had become my specialty. The assignment represented not just professional success, but validation that the military had recognized capabilities in me that my own family had been unable to see. Graduation day at West Point felt like emerging from a cocoon. My parents attended the ceremony, proud but still somewhat bewildered by the transformation they witnessed. The young woman receiving her commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force bore little resemblance to the uncertain girl who'd left Cedar Falls 4 years earlier. I stood taller, spoke with confidence, and carried myself with the bearing of someone who'd discovered exactly what she was capable of achieving. But the most meaningful moment came when Colonel Rodriguez, my first mentor at the academy, shook my hand after the ceremony. He reminded me of our conversation during my 5th week, when I'd been convinced that my West Point experience was about to end in failure. He pointed out that the qualities I'd initially seen as weaknesses had become the foundation of my leadership style, and that the self-doubt that had nearly broken me had ultimately driven me to achieve more than I'd thought possible. As I prepared to leave West Point for my first assignment as an Air Force officer, I carried with me something more valuable than my degree or my commission. I carried the knowledge that strength comes in many forms, that effective leadership requires understanding people as much as understanding systems, and that the voice telling you you're not capable of greatness is usually wrong about what greatness actually looks like. The girl my mother thought too soft to be officer material was about to begin a career that would take her from pilot training to strategic intelligence operations, to the highest levels of military command. But more importantly, she was beginning to understand that her mother's assessment hadn't been malicious or even necessarily wrong within the limited context of their family's experience. It had simply been incomplete, based on definitions of strength and leadership that didn't account for the full spectrum of capabilities that complex challenges require. My next 4 years would test everything I'd learned about myself at West Point. They would challenge my technical skills, my leadership abilities, and my understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than personal ambition. They would also begin to demonstrate that the doubt expressed by someone who loved me but couldn't see me clearly had been transformed into the driving force behind achievements that would ultimately reshape both of our understanding of what I was truly capable of becoming. The flight line at Randolph Air Force Base stretched endlessly under the Texas sun, filled with T-6 Texan II aircraft that would either make or break my aviation career. Pilot training represented the ultimate test of everything I'd learned about myself at West Point, but it also introduced challenges I'd never anticipated. For the first time in my military career, I wasn't just competing against academic standards or leadership evaluation. I was competing against physics, against reflexes honed over years of civilian flying experience I'd never had, and against instructors who'd built their reputations on washing out candidates who couldn't meet their exacting standards. My flight instructor, Captain Mike Torres, was a former fighter pilot whose approach to teaching could generously be described as aggressive. He believed that military aviation was no place for hesitation, second-guessing, or the kind of collaborative decision-making that had served me well in ground-based leadership roles. In the cockpit, he insisted, there was room for only one voice, one decision-maker, one person responsible for keeping both crew members alive under circumstances that could change in microseconds. The first month of flight training shattered my confidence in ways that West Point never had. In the classroom, I excelled at studying aircraft systems, weather patterns, and navigation procedures, but once we moved to actual flying, the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application became painfully obvious. My first solo flight ended with a landing so rough that Captain Torres spent 20 minutes explaining why I was lucky to be alive, let alone still enrolled in the program. But it wasn't just the technical challenges that threatened my progress. The culture of military aviation was unlike anything I'd encountered at West Point. Pilot training attracted a specific type of personality, aggressive, competitive, and supremely confident in their ability to master any challenge through sheer force of will. The collaborative approach that had made me successful as a cadet leader was viewed with suspicion by instructors who believed that military pilots needed to be capable of making split-second decisions without consulting committees or considering multiple perspectives. My struggles became apparent to everyone in the program. While other students progressed through basic maneuvers with increasing confidence, I found myself repeating lessons, requiring additional instruction, and falling behind benchmarks that determined whether students continued to advanced phases of training. The self-doubt that I'd overcome at West Point returned with a vengeance, amplified by the very real possibility that I might wash out of a program that represented the foundation of my intended military career. The breaking point came during my 8th week, when Captain Torres recommended me for additional evaluation by the training squadron commander. The meeting felt like a repeat of my crisis during calculus at West Point, except this time the stakes felt higher. Pilot training washouts didn't just fail a course, they were reassigned to different career fields, often in positions that carried less prestige and fewer opportunities for advancement. I walked into Colonel Sarah Mitchell's office, expecting to receive notification that my aviation career was over before it had properly begun. Colonel Mitchell surprised me with an approach that differed dramatically from Captain Torres's instruction style. Instead of focusing on my deficiencies, she asked questions about my problem-solving methods, my approach to learning complex systems, and my understanding of why certain procedures existed. She had me walk through my thinking during challenging flight scenarios, not to identify mistakes, but to understand how my mind processed information under pressure. What emerged from our conversation was a revelation that changed everything about how I approached pilot training. Colonel Mitchell explained that military aviation attracted 2 distinct types of successful pilots: instinctive flyers, who relied on natural reflexes, and systematic analysts who succeeded through comprehensive understanding of complex systems. She suggested that I'd been trying to force myself into the first category, when my strengths clearly lay in the second. The adjustment required abandoning my attempts to emulate the aggressive confidence that seemed to come naturally to other students. Instead, I began approaching flying the same way I'd approached leadership challenges at West Point, by developing comprehensive understanding of all variables, by practicing systematically until complex procedures became automatic, and by building safety margins into every decision through careful planning and preparation. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was dramatic once it began. My flying improved steadily as I learned to trust systematic preparation over spontaneous reaction. My landings became smoother as I developed approaches based on precise calculations rather than intuitive feel. My performance in emergency procedures improved because I'd studied every possible scenario until appropriate responses became instinct. More importantly, I began to understand that my analytical approach to aviation wasn't a weakness that needed to be overcome, but a strength that needed to be properly developed. The same comprehensive thinking that had made me effective at managing complex leadership situations proved invaluable for managing the multiple systems, communications requirements, and safety considerations that military flying demand. By the end of pilot training, I'd not only met all graduation requirements, but had been selected for advanced training in strategic intelligence operations. This specialized field combined flying with analytical work, requiring pilots who could gather information while operating aircraft in complex environments, and then synthesize that information into intelligence products used by military commanders and national security decision-makers. My first operational assignment took me to Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington, where I joined a squadron responsible for intelligence gathering missions that I still can't discuss in detail. What I can share is that the work combined everything I'd learned about systematic analysis with the flying skills I'd developed through careful study and relentless practice. For the first time in my military career, I found myself in a role that seemed perfectly designed for my particular combination of abilities. The missions were challenging in ways that purely technical flying assignments wouldn't have. We operated in environments where split-second decisions could have strategic implications, where the information we gathered might influence national security policy, and where the analytical skills I'd developed were just as important as my ability to operate aircraft safely under difficult conditions. But it was during my second year at Lewis McChord that I encountered the first serious obstacle to my continued advancement. My squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Walsh, was a traditional military aviator who'd built his career during an era when women were excluded from combat roles and when analytical approaches to problem-solving were viewed as signs of indecision rather than thoroughness. Colonel Walsh never directly challenged my technical competence or my mission performance, both of which were consistently rated among the best in the squadron. Instead, he questioned my leadership potential during evaluation periods, suggesting that my collaborative style was incompatible with the decisive command presence that senior military positions require. He recommended me for technical track assignments that would have limited my opportunities for command positions and essentially ended any possibility of advancement to senior leadership roles. The situation created a professional crisis that was complicated by the fact that Colonel Walsh's assessment wasn't entirely unfair according to traditional military leadership models. My approach to decision-making was indeed more collaborative than authoritarian, more analytical than instinctive, and more focused on long-term consequences than immediate results. By the standards that had defined military leadership for generations, I probably didn't fit the profile of someone destined for senior command position. But the military was changing, slowly and often reluctantly, as global conflicts became more complex, and as traditional approaches to warfare proved inadequate for addressing emerging security challenges. The same analytical thinking that Colonel Walsh viewed as indecision was increasingly valuable for operations that required understanding cultural dynamics, managing interagency cooperation, and developing strategies that addressed root causes rather than just immediate symptoms. My salvation came from an unexpected source. During a routine intelligence briefing that I'd prepared for visiting Pentagon officials, I had the opportunity to present analysis that integrated technical intelligence with broader strategic consideration. The briefing covered not just what we'd observed during our missions, but what those observations implied for long-term regional stability, and how our intelligence-gathering priorities might need to evolve to address changing security environments. One of the visiting officials was Major General Susan Hayes, who was serving in the Pentagon Strategic Planning Division. After my briefing, she asked detailed questions about my analytical methods, my understanding of interagency cooperation requirements, and my thoughts on how military intelligence operations might need to adapt to address emerging security challenges. The conversation lasted nearly an hour and covered topics that went far beyond the technical aspects of intelligence gathering. 3 weeks later, I received orders transferring me to a Pentagon assignment in General Hayes' Strategic Planning Division. The position represented a dramatic career acceleration, moving me from operational squadrons to the highest levels of military strategic planning years earlier than normal career progression would have allowed. It also represented validation that senior military leaders were beginning to recognize analytical thinking as a crucial capability rather than a liability. The Pentagon assignment introduced me to a completely different aspect of military. Instead of flying missions or leading small tactical units, I found myself analyzing global security trends, developing strategic recommendations for senior military and civilian leaders, and participating in interagency planning processes that shaped national security policy. The work required the same systematic thinking that had made me successful in previous assignments, but applied to challenges that could affect millions of people and influence international relations for decades. But the Pentagon also exposed me to military politics in ways that previous assignments hadn't. Strategic planning required building consensus among leaders with different priorities, different philosophical approaches, and different institutional loyalty. The collaborative skills that had served me well throughout my career became essential for managing relationships between military services, civilian agencies, and international partners, who often had conflicting objectives. My performance in strategic planning roles earned recognition that surprised everyone, including myself. Within 18 months of arriving at the Pentagon, I was promoted to major and assigned to lead a strategic analysis team responsible for developing long-term security assessments for multiple global regions. The position required managing civilian analysts, military officers from different services, and liaison relationships with intelligence agencies that operated under different authorities and priorities. The promotion represented more than just career advancement. It demonstrated that the military was evolving to value different types of leadership capability. The same qualities that had made me seem unsuitable for traditional command roles were proving essential for the complex, multifaceted challenges that defined modern national security work. My analytical approach to problem solving, collaborative decision-making style, and ability to synthesize information from multiple sources were exactly what strategic planning required. But success at the Pentagon also created new forms of resistance from people who viewed rapid advancement as evidence that I was somehow gaming the system, rather than earning recognition through genuine capability. Some colleagues suggested that my promotions were the result of diversity initiatives, rather than merit, that my analytical approach masked fundamental weaknesses as a military leader, and that my success in staff positions wouldn't translate to the kind of operational command roles that truly tested military leadership. The criticism stung because it echoed the same doubts my mother had expressed years earlier about my suitability for military. The suggestion that my success was somehow artificial, that I was succeeding in spite of rather than because of my capabilities, threatened to undermine the confidence I'd built through years of proven performance and increasingly demanding assignment. But I was no longer the uncertain girl who'd arrived at West Point questioning whether she belonged in military service. I'd learned that criticism often said more about the critics than about the person being criticized, and that the same qualities that made some people uncomfortable were precisely what made me effective at addressing challenges that traditional approaches couldn't solve. The real test of my leadership capabilities came when General Hayes assigned me to lead a joint task force responsible for developing strategic responses to emerging security challenges in Southeast Asia. The assignment required coordinating with civilian agencies, international partners, and military units from multiple services to develop comprehensive approaches that addressed traditional military threats as well as economic, environmental, and social factors that contributed to regional instability. The task force succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, developing strategies that were ultimately adopted as the foundation for long-term American security policy in the region. But more importantly for my career, the assignment demonstrated that my leadership style was not just effective in staff positions, but could produce results in complex operational environments that required managing diverse stakeholders with conflicting priorities. The success led to my promotion to lieutenant colonel and assignment to an operational command position that would test everything I'd learned about leadership, strategic thinking, and managing complex organizations under pressure. It also brought me to the attention of senior Pentagon officials who were beginning to recognize that the military needed leaders capable of thinking beyond traditional operational frameworks. But it was also during this period that the resistance to my advancement became more organized and more personal. A group of senior officers, who viewed my rapid promotion as evidence of declining military standards, began questioning not just my qualifications, but my fundamental fitness for military leadership. They suggested that my success in analytical roles had given me an inflated sense of my own capabilities, and that assigning me to operational command positions represented a dangerous experiment that could have serious consequences for military effectiveness. The opposition wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal, attacking not just my leadership style, but my character, my motivations, and my understanding of what military service truly required. It was exactly the kind of systematic campaign designed to undermine confidence and force resignation that had destroyed other military careers, and it represented the most serious threat I'd faced since arriving at West Point as an uncertain 18-year-old. But I was no longer that uncertain girl, and I was no longer fighting these battles alone. The same analytical approach that critics viewed as weakness had created a network of allies who understood that the military's future success depended on embracing different types of leadership capabilities. The collaborative decision-making style that traditional leaders viewed with suspicion had built relationships with civilian officials, international partners, and military colleagues, who valued comprehensive thinking over instinctive reaction. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just my own career trajectory but whether the military was prepared to embrace the kind of leadership that emerging security challenges required. The girl my mother thought too soft to be officer material was about to face the ultimate test of everything she'd learned about strength, leadership, and the courage required to stand up for what you believe in when powerful people are determined to prove you wrong. The call came at 3 a.m, jerking me from the deepest sleep I'd managed in weeks. General Hayes's voice was tense in a way I'd never heard before, cutting through the darkness of my Pentagon apartment with news that would change everything. A crisis was developing in the Pacific Theater that required immediate strategic response, and the joint task force I'd been preparing to lead was being activated 6 months ahead of schedule. I had 72 hours to deploy to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where I would coordinate multinational responses to a situation that threatened to destabilize the entire region. The details were classified beyond my current clearance level, but the urgency in General Hayes's voice told me everything I needed to know about the magnitude of what we were facing. This wasn't a training exercise or a theoretical planning scenario. This was the real test of everything I'd learned about strategic leadership, the moment when analytical thinking would either prove its value under actual crisis conditions, or demonstrate that critics had been right about my unsuitability for operational command. The flight to Germany gave me time to review intelligence briefings that painted a picture more complex than anything I'd encountered during my Pentagon assignment. Multiple state and non-state actors were positioning themselves to exploit regional tensions, creating a web of competing interests that traditional military responses couldn't address effectively. The situation required not just tactical coordination but strategic thinking that considered political, economic, and social factors alongside pure military capability. Ramstein Air Base buzzed with activity when I arrived, filled with personnel from multiple nations who'd been pulled from routine assignments to address a crisis that everyone understood but no one was allowed to discuss openly. The command center where I'd be working looked like something from a science fiction movie, multiple screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds, communication links to military and civilian leaders across 3 continents, and analytical systems that could process information faster than human minds could comprehend. But it was the people that presented the real challenge. My task force included American military officers who outranked me in years of service if not in formal authority, civilian intelligence analysts who'd spent decades developing expertise in regional dynamics, and international liaison officers who represented countries with their own strategic priorities and operational constraints. Managing this diverse group required every leadership skill I'd developed over the previous decade, plus several I'd need to learn under pressure. The first crisis meeting revealed the complexity of what we were facing. Intelligence indicated that multiple scenarios could unfold simultaneously, each requiring different response strategies and different international coordination mechanisms. Traditional military planning processes, which relied on clear command structures and predetermined response protocols, were inadequate for managing a situation where political considerations changed hourly, and where military actions could have unintended consequences that complicated diplomatic effort. My approach to managing the crisis team reflected everything I'd learned about collaborative leadership, but applied under circumstances where failure could have global implications. Instead of issuing orders based on incomplete information, I structured our decision-making processes to leverage the expertise that each team member brought to complex problems. The civilian analysts provided context about regional political dynamics, international liaison officers explained their government's constraints and capabilities, and military specialists translated strategic objectives into operational possibility. The system worked, but it also attracted criticism from senior officials who monitored our operations from Washington. Some Pentagon leaders expressed concern that collaborative decision-making was too slow for crisis response, that seeking input from multiple sources introduced unnecessary complexity into situations that required decisive action, and that my leadership style reflected the same analytical hesitation that had concerned previous supervisors throughout my career. The criticism intensified when our initial recommendations differed significantly from conventional military responses that other commands were proposing. While traditional approaches focused on demonstrating American military capability through shows of force, our analysis suggested that regional stability required addressing underlying economic and political grievances that military action alone couldn't resolve. We recommended a comprehensive strategy that combined targeted military deployments with diplomatic initiatives and economic assistance programs. The debate over strategic approaches became personal when Colonel Richard Hayes, no relation to General Hayes despite sharing a surname, arrived at Ramstein to serve as Pentagon liaison to our operation. Colonel Hayes represented the traditional military leadership that viewed my rapid advancement with suspicion, and my analytical approach to strategy as evidence of fundamental weakness in understanding what military service required. Colonel Hayes wasted no time in challenging every aspect of how I'd structured our crisis response operations. He questioned why civilian analysts were participating in strategic planning discussions, why we were consulting with international partners before finalizing American position, and why our recommendations prioritized long-term stability over immediate demonstrations of American military dominance. His criticism wasn't just professional, it was designed to undermine confidence in my leadership among team members who were already adapting to operational demands, unlike anything they'd previously experienced. The confrontation came to a head during our third week at Ramstein, when Colonel Hayes formally recommended to Pentagon leadership that our task force be restructured under traditional military command protocol. His report suggested that collaborative decision-making had slowed our response time, that consulting with international partners had compromised operational security, and that my leadership style was fundamentally incompatible with the decisive action that crisis management required. The recommendation created a crisis within the crisis, threatening to disrupt operations at the moment when regional tensions were reaching their peak. Pentagon officials scheduled a video conference to review our performance and determine whether organizational changes were necessary to ensure effective crisis response. The meeting would determine not just the future of our task force, but whether the military was prepared to embrace analytical approaches to strategic leadership, or would revert to traditional command models that prioritize decisiveness over comprehensive understanding. I spent the night before the Pentagon review session preparing for what felt like the most important presentation of my military career. The stakes went beyond my personal advancement or even the success of our current mission. The review would determine whether the military was prepared to evolve its leadership models to address the complex, multifaceted challenges that defined modern security environment. The presentation began with Colonel Hayes outlining his concerns about our operational methods and their implications for military effectiveness. He presented charts showing decision timelines that he characterized as excessive, communication protocols that he described as overly complex, and strategic recommendations that he suggested reflected academic theorizing rather than practical military judgment. His presentation was professionally devastating, systematically dismantling every aspect of how we'd approached crisis management. When my turn came to respond, I chose not to defend our methods, but to demonstrate their result. I presented analysis showing how our comprehensive approach had identified potential complications that traditional military responses would have missed, how international coordination had enhanced rather than compromised American influence, and how addressing underlying causes of instability had created opportunities for long-term success that purely military solutions couldn't achieve. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. The regional crisis that had prompted our deployment was beginning to stabilize in ways that validated our strategic approach. Political tensions were decreasing as economic assistance programs addressed grievances that military pressure alone couldn't resolve. International cooperation was strengthening as partners who'd been consulted during strategy development became invested in implementation success. Most importantly, American influence in the region was increasing because our comprehensive approach had demonstrated understanding of complex local dynamics rather than just military capability. The Pentagon officials conducting the review could see the results in real-time intelligence feeds that showed improving regional stability indicators across multiple measurement categories. Our collaborative approach to strategy development had produced outcomes that traditional military responses typically couldn't achieve, demonstrating that analytical thinking enhanced rather than compromised operational effectiveness under complex circumstances. General Hayes, who'd been observing the review session, provided the decisive intervention. She pointed out that modern security challenges required exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking that our task force had demonstrated, that future military effectiveness would depend on leaders who could integrate multiple sources of information, rather than relying on traditional operational templates, and that my leadership style represented evolution rather than deviation from military excellence. The Pentagon officials concluded the review by expanding rather than restricting our operational authority. Our task force would serve as a pilot program for developing new approaches to strategic leadership, with implications for how the military managed complex international crises. The decision represented validation not just for our specific methods, but for the broader principle that military effectiveness required embracing different types of leadership capabilities. But personal validation came from sources that meant more to me than official recognition. Team members who'd initially been skeptical of collaborative decision-making approaches had become advocates for methods that enhanced their ability to contribute expertise to complex problems. International liaison officers reported that their governments viewed American military leadership more favorably because our approach demonstrated respect for partner nation perspectives and capability. Most importantly, the crisis itself was resolving in ways that created opportunities for long-term regional stability rather than just temporary suppression of immediate threat. The comprehensive strategy that collaborative analysis had produced was addressing root causes of instability in ways that purely military responses couldn't achieve, demonstrating that the analytical approach critics had characterized as weakness was actually essential for addressing complex modern challenges. The success at Ramstein led to my promotion to colonel and assignment to lead strategic planning for an entire theater of operations. The position represented recognition that analytical leadership had proven its value under the most demanding circumstances, and that the military needed more leaders capable of thinking beyond traditional operational frameworks. But the real transformation was personal. The confidence that had been shaken by Colonel Hayes's criticism had been rebuilt through demonstrated success under circumstances that traditional leadership approaches couldn't handle effectively. I'd learned that collaborative decision-making wasn't a sign of weakness but a source of strength when dealing with problems that required multiple types of expertise. The girl my mother thought too emotional to be officer material had become a colonel whose emotional intelligence enhanced military effectiveness rather than compromising it. The analytical thinking that critics had characterized as indecision had proven essential for managing complex situations where decisive action based on incomplete information could have disastrous consequences. More importantly, I'd learned that military excellence wasn't about conforming to traditional leadership models, but about developing capabilities that addressed the challenges military service actually required. The same qualities that had made me seem unsuitable for military leadership according to conventional wisdom were precisely what modern military leadership demanded when dealing with complex, multifaceted security challenges. As I prepared to leave Ramstein for my new assignment, I reflected on how far I'd traveled from the uncertain girl who'd left Cedar Falls wondering if she had what military service required. The journey had been marked by consistent themes: analytical thinking that others viewed as weakness until it proved essential, collaborative approaches that critics characterized as indecision until they produced results that traditional methods couldn't achieve, and emotional intelligence that was dismissed as softness until it enhanced military effectiveness under demanding circumstances. The next phase of my career would test everything I'd learned about leadership on an even larger scale, with responsibilities that affected not just individual missions, but entire strategic regions. But I was no longer the person who needed external validation to understand my own capability. I'd learned that strength came in forms that traditional military culture didn't always recognize, and that effective leadership required embracing rather than suppressing the qualities that made me different from conventional military leaders. The stage was set for the final test of everything I'd learned about myself and about what military excellence actually required in an era where traditional approaches to leadership were inadequate for addressing the challenges that defined modern security environments. The girl who'd been told she was too soft to be officer material was about to discover that the military's future success depended on exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking that her critics had spent years trying to discourage. The phone call that would change military history came on a Tuesday morning in November, while I was reviewing intelligence reports in my office at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. General Hayes's voice carried an excitement I'd rarely heard from someone who'd spent 30 years in military service, cutting through the routine bustle of base operations with news that seemed too extraordinary to be real. The Secretary of Defense wanted to see me in Washington within 24 hours for what she described as a conversation about my future that would surprise everyone involved, including myself. The flight to Washington gave me time to consider what this summons might mean. My performance as a theater strategic planning colonel had exceeded every expectation, earning recognition from military leaders, civilian officials, and international partners who'd worked with our commands during increasingly complex global operations. But recognition and promotion were different things, and the leap from colonel to general officer represented a quantum jump that typically required political connections, perfect timing, and the kind of institutional support that I'd never assumed I possessed. The Pentagon seemed different when I arrived for my meeting with Secretary of Defense Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a former academic who'd brought analytical rigor to civilian oversight of military operations. Her office reflected the intersection of intellectual depth and practical authority that defined her approach to national security leadership, filled with strategic studies texts alongside operational reports that shaped daily defense decisions. Secretary Morrison wasted no time on pleasantries, beginning our conversation with a question that immediately revealed the scope of what we were discussing. She asked whether I'd ever considered what military leadership would look like in 20 years when the challenges facing American national security would require integration of traditional military capabilities with technological innovation, diplomatic sophistication, and understanding of complex global systems that current leadership models weren't designed to address. The question launched a discussion that lasted nearly 2 hours, covering everything from emerging security threats to the evolution of military leadership capabilities to the institutional changes that would be necessary for maintaining American military effectiveness in an increasingly complex world. Secretary Morrison probed my understanding of how analytical thinking enhanced rather than complicated military decision-making, how collaborative approaches to strategy development produced better results than traditional command hierarchies, and how emotional intelligence contributed to effective leadership under circumstances where purely technical competence was insufficient. But the real purpose of our meeting became clear when Secretary Morrison explained that the Pentagon was facing a crisis of leadership development that threatened long-term military effectiveness. Traditional promotion systems had produced senior officers who excelled at managing conventional military operations, but struggled with the multifaceted challenges that defined modern security environments. The military needed leaders who could think strategically about complex problems, work effectively with diverse stakeholders, and adapt quickly to circumstances that changed faster than traditional planning processes could accommodate. She outlined a pilot program designed to accelerate the development of officers whose capabilities matched emerging security requirements rather than historical precedent. The program would identify individuals whose demonstrated performance under complex circumstances indicated potential for senior leadership roles, regardless of whether their career progression had followed traditional pathways. The goal was to place analytically sophisticated leaders in positions where they could influence institutional evolution, rather than waiting for conventional promotion timelines to gradually produce the leadership capabilities that future challenges would require. The conversation took a personal turn when Secretary Morrison asked about my experience with institutional resistance to analytical approaches to military leadership. She'd obviously reviewed my entire career file, including the criticism I'd faced from traditional military leaders who viewed collaborative decision-making as evidence of weakness rather than strength. Her questions demonstrated understanding that promoting officers whose leadership styles differed from conventional military models would require institutional support from the highest levels of civilian and military authority. Secretary Morrison explained that the President had authorized a historic change in military leadership development, creating opportunities for exceptional officers to advance to senior positions based on demonstrated capability rather than traditional career progression requirements. The program represented recognition that future military effectiveness required leaders who could address challenges that conventional military education and experience hadn't prepared previous generations to handle. When she offered me promotion to Brigadier General, effective immediately, the magnitude of what was happening took several moments to fully register. At 34, I would become the youngest female general officer in Air Force history, leapfrogging 2 ranks in recognition of capabilities that previous promotion systems had been unable to properly evaluate. The promotion represented not just personal advancement, but validation of the principle that military excellence required embracing different types of leadership rather than conforming to traditional models. But Secretary Morrison also made clear that the promotion came with responsibilities that extended beyond normal general officer duty. I would serve as a visible symbol of institutional change, demonstrating that the military was serious about evolving its leadership culture to address modern challenges. My performance would be scrutinized by critics who viewed accelerated promotion as evidence of declining standards, by supporters who hoped analytical leadership would enhance military effectiveness, and by international observers who were watching whether American military institutions could adapt to changing strategic environment. The promotion ceremony took place in the Pentagon's most prestigious venue, attended by senior military leaders, civilian officials, and family members who'd traveled from across the country to witness a moment that none of us had imagined possible when I'd left Cedar Falls 15 years earlier. General Hayes administered the oath, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd championed institutional change against significant resistance and was finally seeing validation of her effort. But the moment that meant the most came when my parents arrived for the ceremony, traveling from Iowa to witness their daughter receiving recognition that exceeded their wildest expectations. My father looked proud but somewhat bewildered by the transformation he was witnessing, while my mother appeared to be processing emotions too complex for simple categorization. The woman who'd once told me I was too soft to be officer material was watching me receive the Silver Star of a general officer from the Secretary of Defense. After the ceremony, my mother approached me with tears in her eyes and words she'd obviously been preparing throughout the flight from Cedar Falls. She apologized not just for doubting my capabilities, but for limiting her definition of strength to such a narrow range of characteristics that she'd been unable to recognize qualities that military service actually required. She admitted that her assessment had been based on assumptions about military leadership that reflected outdated stereotypes rather than understanding of what modern challenges demanded. But more importantly, she expressed pride, not just in my promotion but in the journey that had led to this moment. She'd watched from a distance as I'd overcome every obstacle, adapted to every challenge, and ultimately succeeded through developing rather than suppressing the qualities she'd initially viewed as weaknesses. Her words carried the weight of recognition that strength comes in forms that loving families don't always immediately understand. The real validation came from sources beyond family recognition. Military leaders who'd initially questioned my leadership style acknowledged that analytical approaches to strategy had produced results that traditional methods couldn't achieve. International partners reported that collaborative decision-making had enhanced rather than compromised American influence in complex strategic environments. Most importantly, younger officers were beginning to understand that military excellence required intellectual sophistication alongside physical courage and technical competence. My first assignment as a general officer involved leading strategic planning for military responses to emerging global challenges that required exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking that had defined my entire career. The position offered opportunities to influence institutional development in ways that would enhance military effectiveness for decades, ensuring that future challenges would be addressed by leaders prepared for complexity rather than trained only for conventional scenarios. But the personal transformation was more significant than professional advancement. The girl who'd left Cedar Falls wondering if she belonged in military service had become a general officer whose approach to leadership would influence military culture for generations. The qualities that had once seemed like barriers to success had become the foundation for achievements that conventional wisdom suggested were impossible. Standing in Pentagon Briefing Room 3A for my first strategic planning meeting as a general officer, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every challenge had contributed to developing capabilities that military service required but traditional leadership models hadn't properly valued. Every moment of doubt had strengthened resolve that enabled persistence through obstacles that might have defeated someone who'd never questioned their own potential. The analytical thinking that critics had characterized as indecision had proven essential for managing complex situations where quick decisions based on incomplete information could have disastrous consequences. The collaborative approach that traditionalists had viewed with suspicion had enhanced military effectiveness by leveraging diverse expertise rather than relying on individual judgment. The emotional intelligence that had been dismissed as softness had improved every aspect of leadership effectiveness by enabling understanding of human factors that influenced mission success. Most importantly, I'd learned that strength comes in many forms, that leadership requires adaptation rather than conformity, and that challenging institutional assumptions often produces better results than accepting conventional wisdom without question. The voice that had once told me I wasn't capable of military excellence had been replaced by confidence based on demonstrated performance under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. As I prepared to brief senior Pentagon officials on strategic recommendations that would influence national security policy, I thought about the path that had led from my mother's kitchen in Cedar Falls to this moment. Every step had been necessary for developing the capabilities that military leadership actually required, even when those steps seemed to lead away from rather than toward conventional definitions of success. The girl my mother thought too soft to be officer material had become the youngest female general in Air Force history, through embracing rather than suppressing the qualities that made her different from traditional military leaders. The journey had required persistence, adaptation, and the courage to trust her own judgment when institutional pressure encouraged conformity to expectations that didn't match her capability. But most importantly, the journey had demonstrated that military excellence in the modern era required exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking, collaborative leadership, and analytical sophistication that previous generations of military leaders had been encouraged to suppress. The future of American military effectiveness depended on officers who could think strategically about complex problems, work effectively with diverse stakeholders, and adapt quickly to circumstances that changed faster than traditional responses could accommodate. The transformation was complete, but the mission was just beginning. The youngest general in Air Force history had work to do that would influence military effectiveness for decades, ensuring that future challenges would be addressed by leaders prepared for complexity rather than limited by conventional assumptions about what military leadership required. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.